The desert doesn't begin with sand, it begins with silence. A hush hangs over the hills outside Hebron, where the wind brushes dry grass like a whispered warning. In the far distance, the morning sun lifts itself slowly, turning the horizon the color of warm bronze. And somewhere between the tents of a wealthy household and the wide-open wilderness, a young woman walks with her shoulders tight as if she's carrying words she's not allowed to speak. Her name is Hagar. She's Egyptian, far from the familiar scent of the Nile, far from the songs of her childhood. In Abraham's camp, she is called a servant, a maid, a helper. But titles don't tell you what it feels like to be watched more than you're heard, to belong to a household and still feel like you don't belong to yourself. Abram, later called Abraham, has been living by a promise that sounds too big for ordinary life. God has spoken to him about a future, about descendants as countless as the stars. And yet, day after day, the camp wakes up to the same reality. No child's laughter near Sarai's tent. No small footsteps running through the dust. Time can do that. It can turn hope into pressure. Sarai feels it most. She's not cruel by nature. She's weary. She's lived long enough to know how people look at a woman without children. In this world, that kind of waiting can feel like a verdict, not a season. And then Sarai makes a plan, one that sounds practical, even accepted in the culture around them. It's the kind of plan people make when they believe God is good, but not sure God will be on time. She calls Hagar into her tent. The air inside smells of woven fabric and oil lamps. Sarai's voice is steady, too steady, the way someone sounds when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. She tells Abram, in Hagar's hearing, that she will give her servant to him, so that a child might come through her. Scripture captures the logic in plain words. Maybe I can build a family through her. Genesis 16:2, paraphrased. Hagar stands there, listening, trying to understand what her life is becoming. No one asks what she wants. No one asks what she fears. Days pass, and what was arranged becomes real. Hagar becomes pregnant, and that single fact changes everything, like a spark dropped into dry straw. Because now Sarai isn't only waiting, she is watching. The camp begins to feel smaller. Conversations pause when Hagar walks by. Eyes follow her, not with kindness, but with calculation. Hagar can feel it, the strange shift in power, the unspoken tension. She is still a servant, and yet she carries the child of the household. And something rises inside Hagar, maybe pride, maybe relief, maybe the first taste of being seen. Genesis hints at it. She began to look at Sarai differently. Genesis 16:4, paraphrased. Not with open insult, but with that quiet expression that says, I have what you don't. That look cuts deeper than words. Sarai feels the sting and turns it into accusation. She confronts Abram, and the camp's fragile peace cracks. Abram responds with distance, letting Sarai handle it, letting the situation become harsh rather than healed. And Hagar, caught in the middle of a promise that wasn't spoken to her, learned something painful. When powerful people make fearful plans, the vulnerable often pay the price. The tension becomes too much to breathe. The days become heavy. The nights become restless. And finally, Hagar does the only thing she feels she can do. She runs out past the tents, past the grazing animals, past the place where human voices fade. She runs toward the wilderness, toward uncertainty, because even uncertainty feels lighter than staying where she is unseen. And as the desert opens in front of her like an endless question, Hagar doesn't know it yet, but heaven is already looking for her. The wilderness is honest. It doesn't pretend to be friendly. It doesn't flatter your dreams. It simply stretches out, wide and quiet, until you start hearing your own thoughts louder than the wind. Hagar runs until her breathing burns. The camp disappears behind the rolling hills, swallowed by distance. Her feet ache. Her mouth turns dry, and her hands tremble when she finally slows down. She is alone now, a servant who has stepped outside the only structure she's ever known. A pregnant woman walking into open land with no map, no protection, no guarantee of tomorrow. The sun climbs higher, and the air turns thin and sharp. Then she sees it, a spring, a small stubborn line of water gathered in the dust, like mercy that refuses to vanish. Hagar drops to her knees. She drinks too fast at first, then slows, letting the water steady her. She splashes her face, and for a moment the world stops spinning. But relief doesn't answer the bigger question. Where do I go now? Behind her is a household filled with tension and harsh words. Ahead is a land filled with strangers and danger, and inside her is a life she didn't choose in the way people talk about choosing, but a life that is real all the same. Hagar sits beside the spring, hugging her arms around herself. She watches the water ripple. She tries to imagine Egypt. She tries to picture the Nile, the streets, the sounds. Maybe there's family somewhere. Maybe there's a way back. But even if she reaches home, what then? She's carrying Abram's child, Sarai's plan made flesh. She can already feel the weight of that reality pressing into the future. She can already sense that this baby will never be a simple thing. The wind shifts. The air seems to change temperature, as if the desert itself takes a slow breath. And then, without warning, Hagar realizes she is not alone. It's not a sound at first. It's a presence, a stillness that doesn't feel empty, more like the moment right before a storm breaks, except there is no fear in it. The world goes quiet in a way that makes her heart thud against her ribs. She looks up, and there he is, standing near the spring. Scripture calls him the angel of the Lord, Genesis 16:7. But this is not an ordinary messenger, not a passing traveler. The way he stands, steady, unshaken by heat or distance, makes Hagar feel like she is looking at someone who belongs to heaven more than earth. Hagar freezes. Her mind races through every story she's heard around the camp. Stories of God speaking to Abram, of altars built, of promises made. But she never imagined any of that would reach her. Not her, not the Egyptian servant, not the woman running away. The angel speaks her name. Hagar. Just that. Her name. Like it matters. Like she matters. Like she isn't simply Sarai's maid or the pregnant servant or the problem. And then he asks a question that lands like a mirror held up to her soul. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Genesis 16:8 paraphrased. Hagar swallows hard. It's the kind of question that's impossible to answer without telling the truth. She could lie. She could pretend she's on a journey, that she has a plan. But in front of this presence, pretending feels pointless. So her voice comes out small and raw. I'm running from my mistress Sarai. The words hang in the air. The angel's gaze doesn't condemn her. It reads her, like someone who sees the bruises beneath the story, the fear beneath the pride, the ache beneath the anger. And then he speaks again, calm, clear, and surprising. The message is not what Hagar expects, because heaven has found her, but heaven is about to ask something hard. Hagar expects comfort, not the kind that changes everything, just enough to keep her going. A blessing, a promise, maybe permission to keep running, maybe a quiet, I understand. But the angel of the Lord speaks with a firmness that feels like truth itself. Go back, he says, words that hit like a sudden gust. Return to your mistress and submit under her hand. Genesis 16:9, paraphrased. Hagar's shoulders tighten. Her breath catches. Go back. Back to the tense tent lines. Back to the eyes that measure her. Back to Sarai's anger, sharper now because it has been wounded. For a moment, Hagar's mind argues. It brings up every reason she has to keep walking, every memory that pushed her into the wilderness in the first place. The desert may be dangerous, but at least it doesn't humiliate her. Yet the angel doesn't speak like someone making a cruel demand. His words carry something else, an unseen strength, like a bridge being lowered over a deep ravine. And then he continues. I will greatly multiply your descendants, he says, so they cannot be counted. Genesis 16:10, paraphrased. Hagar blinks as if the sunlight has flashed. That promise, those kinds of words, she has heard them before. Those are the words Abram lives on. Those are the words Sarai aches for. But now they are spoken to her, to the servant, to the foreign woman, to the runaway. It's as if heaven is saying, you are not outside my story. Hagar's throat tightens. She presses a hand to her belly. The baby is still invisible to the world, but not invisible to God. The angel speaks again, and the message becomes even more specific, even more personal. You are pregnant, he says, and you will bear a son. Genesis 16:11, paraphrased. And then he gives Hagar something no one has offered her yet, the right to name her child. Call him Ishmael. The name lands with a strange, steady peace. Ishmael, God hears. Not God heard Abram, not God heard Sarai. God hears you. Hagar exhales shakily. She has lived in a household where decisions move above her head like clouds, important, heavy, and unreachable. But here, beside a spring in the wilderness, heaven speaks to her as if she is a real person with a real future. Still, the angel doesn't pretend the road will be simple. He describes Ishmael's life in broad strokes, strong, untamed, living in tension with others. Genesis 16:12, paraphrased. Not as a curse, but as a realistic portrait. This child will carry fire in his spirit. He will not be easily controlled. Hagar listens, absorbing the weight of it. This is not a fairy tale promise where every problem disappears. It's a promise that God will be with her in a complicated future, that he sees what others overlook, that he hears what others dismiss. For a long moment, neither of them moves. The desert wind brushes the surface of the spring, making small ripples like silent applause. And then something breaks open inside Hagar, not fear, but awe. Because the angel didn't just speak about God. He spoke with God's authority, God's knowledge, God's attention. He knew her name. He knew her condition. He knew her future. He met her in the exact place she thought she had disappeared. Hagar looks at him with eyes that shine, not from heat now, but from realization. In the household, she has been used. In the camp, she has been blamed. In the wilderness, she thought she would be forgotten. But she is not forgotten. Scripture says she gave the Lord a name there, a name born from the shock of being seen. You are the God who sees me. Genesis 16:13, paraphrased. It's one thing to believe God sees nations and patriarchs. It's another thing to discover he sees a single woman sitting by a spring, trembling and unsure, wondering if her life matters. Hagar glances down at the water. The spring reflects light in broken pieces. She can see her face, dusty, tired, changed. She can see the sky behind her, endless and bright. And she understands something she never understood before. Even here, God is present. Even now, God is listening. The angel's words still stand. Go back. Not because Sarai is right, not because Hagar deserves pain, but because God's promise is bigger than the moment, and the path forward somehow runs through the place she tried to escape. Hagar rises slowly. She wipes her face. Her fear hasn't vanished, but it has been joined by something stronger. Purpose! She turns her body toward the distant hills, toward the camp she fled. And with every step, the name echoes in her heart like a drumbeat. Ishmael. God hears. The walk back feels longer than the run. When Hagar fled, her feet were fast, her thoughts loud, her heart burning with one simple goal, away. But now, each step toward the camp carries the weight of the angel's words, words that didn't erase her pain, but gave it meaning. The wilderness behind her is still wide and silent. The spring is now a memory, though she keeps glancing back as if to make sure it really happened. Did heaven truly meet me? Her hand rests on her belly again and again, not out of habit, but out of wonder. She isn't just carrying a child, she's carrying a name. Ishmael. God hears. A reminder stitched into her future. As the sun lowers, the familiar outlines appear. Grazing animals, smoke rising from cooking fires, the stitched shapes of tents. Abraham's household sits in the valley like a small city made of fabric and routine. From a distance it looks peaceful. Hagar knows better. She steps closer, and her body remembers the tension that lives here. People notice her quickly. Heads turn. Voices soften. A few faces flash with surprise, some with judgment, some with relief, some with curiosity that doesn't feel kind. She keeps walking. She doesn't storm in. She doesn't demand apologies. She moves with a quiet steadiness, like someone who has been to the edge of her own story and returned with something invisible but strong. When she reaches Sarai's tent, the air feels tight. The entrance flap shifts as someone inside senses her presence. Sarai steps out. For a moment, the world holds its breath. Sarai's eyes move over Hagar's dusty clothes, her tired face, the way her shoulders sit. Different now, as if they're held up by something Sarai cannot see. Sarai's expression is not soft. It is controlled, guarded, and sharp around the edges. No welcoming words come, only the question behind Sarai's stare, "Why are you back?" Hagar feels her old fear rise up. She remembers the harshness. She remembers the nights that made her run, but then she remembers the desert spring. She remembers her name spoken by a voice that didn't treat her like property. So she speaks, not with rebellion, not with insult, but with truth. "I met the angel of the Lord," she says. It sounds strange in the open air, like thunder spoken quietly. Nearby servants pretend not to listen, but their bodies lean toward the words. Sarai's eyes narrow slightly. In this household, God speaks to Abram. God gives visions, promises, directions. But to Hagar? Sarai doesn't say it, but the doubt hangs in the space between them. Hagar continues, steady as the spring water. "He told me to return. He told me I will have a son, and I am to name him Ishmael." The name lands with a quiet force. God hears. Not everyone in the camp believes quickly. Some glance at one another. Some look at Abram's tent as if expecting him to step out and confirm it. But even skepticism can't fully erase the weight of Hagar's calm. Abram is called. He comes out from his tent with the slow, thoughtful movements of a man who carries promises in his bones. His face is weathered by sun and years, but his eyes still hold the kind of attention that makes people feel small. He looks at Hagar. He sees the dust, the fatigue, the seriousness. "Hagar," he says, her name, spoken by the master of the household, but softer than usual. "What happened?" Hagar tells the story again, and the camp listens as if the air itself is listening. She speaks of the spring in the wilderness, of the question, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Of the command to return, of the promise, "I will multiply your descendants," of the name. Abram's expression changes the more he hears. Not disbelief, something deeper, recognition, the kind that says, "This sounds like God," because Abram knows the voice of promise. He has heard it under starlit skies. He has built altars from that voice. He has walked miles guided by it. Now that same pattern of mercy has reached the one person in the camp who seemed least likely to receive it. Abram doesn't argue. He doesn't dismiss Hagar. He doesn't say, "That can't be." He simply nods, as if the pieces of God's story have shifted again, expanding, making room for someone unexpected. But even with heaven's words, the household is still human. Sarai's posture remains tense. Her face holds conflict, the sting of being looked down on, the ache of still being childless, the discomfort of realizing God has spoken into a situation she tried to control. Hagar senses it. The tension hasn't vanished. The future is still complicated. Yet something is different now. Hagar is not walking on thin air anymore. She is walking on a promise. And in the quiet days that follow, as her pregnancy grows, the camp watches her, some with suspicion, some with quiet respect, all with the uneasy awareness that God has stepped into the space between their choices. Time moves forward. The nights cool. The winds change. The belly of the servant grows round. And when the day finally comes, the camp hears the cry of a newborn boy. Abram holds him, and with a voice steady enough to carry across the tents, he speaks the name Hagar was given in the wilderness, Ishmael. God hears. And for Hagar, the name is more than a label. It is proof that the God of Abram also sees the one who once felt invisible. Years pass in a way that feels almost gentle at first. The household grows used to Ishmael's presence, his quick feet in the dust, his laughter near the tents, his curious hands reaching for everything. Hagar watches him with a fierce kind of love, the kind that forms when a child arrives after fear and wilderness and unanswered questions. She names him again and again in her heart. God hears. And for a while, it seems like life might settle into something steady. Not perfect, never perfect, but manageable. Hagar learns where Sarai's moods bend and where they break. She learns when to speak and when to stay quiet. She learns how to keep her son close without drawing too much attention. But time has a way of reopening old wounds, because Sarai is still Sarai, carrying the ache of waiting. Abram is still Abram, carrying a promise that keeps stretching into years, and the God who speaks keeps speaking. One evening, the air in the camp feels different. It's not a storm, it's not an argument. It's that quiet intensity that arrives when something unseen is about to happen. Sarai begins to change, not in a way people can name quickly. She grows thoughtful, restless, then strangely alive, like hope is waking up inside her after a long sleep. Hagar notices it in small details. Sarai pauses more often at the edge of Abram's tent. She touches her own stomach with a distant look, as if listening to her body. Then the whispers begin. At first they're cautious. Quiet voices near water jars, glances between women preparing bread, a servant passing by with widened eyes. Sarai is expecting. Hagar hears it and feels her chest tighten, not with hatred, but with dread. Because if Sarai has a child, everything changes. A promise fulfilled doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings a new kind of conflict, especially when people have tried to force the promise into their own timing. The months unfold like a slow drumbeat. Sarai's pregnancy becomes undeniable. Abram's face brightens in ways Hagar hasn't seen before. The camp shifts around Sarai with careful attention and new respect. The household becomes organized around the coming birth. More food stored, more voices speaking about the future. Hagar smiles when she has to. She offers help when she's called. She keeps her hands busy so her thoughts don't run too wild. But inside, she feels the ground moving. Ishmael, her boy, her answered prayer in the wilderness, is now a reminder of the plans Sarai once made in desperation. Ishmael is loved by Abram, yes, but he is also a living symbol of Sarai's long humiliation. And now, Sarai is no longer waiting. She is carrying what she wanted most. When Sarai gives birth, the camp celebrates like a long winter has ended. There's singing, there's food, there are smiles that stretch wide with relief. Abram names the child Isaac, laughter, because joy has finally arrived where sadness used to sit. Hagar watches from the edge of it all, holding Ishmael close. She doesn't hate the baby. She can't. A child is a child. But she can feel the shift in everyone's eyes. Their attention moves toward Sarai and Isaac, like the sun turning toward morning, and Hagar once again is standing in the shadow of someone else's story. As Isaac grows, the camp becomes louder with happiness. Abram plays with the boy. Sarai laughs more easily. The household begins to speak of the promise as if it has finally found its true home. But there's a tension that doesn't vanish, only changes shape. Ishmael is no longer a toddler. He's older now, strong, full of life, quick to respond. He notices things. He asks questions. He feels the difference between how people look at him and how they look at Isaac. And one day, at a celebration, an important moment for Isaac, a feast marking his early growth, the air is full of music and clapping hands. People gather. Sarai is radiant, finally tasting the joy she waited for. Hagar stands nearby, trying to stay small. Then Ishmael laughs. It's not a sweet, innocent laugh. It's the laugh of an older boy who doesn't know how to hold all the emotions inside him. Maybe it's teasing. Maybe it's bitterness. Maybe it's just awkwardness in the middle of celebration. Genesis describes Sarai seeing Ishmael mocking. Genesis 21:9, paraphrase. Sarai's face hardens in an instant. Old pain rises like fire. The years of waiting, the humiliations, the memory of Hagar's pregnancy, and that look that once cut deep. Sarai's heart doesn't pause to interpret the boy's laughter gently. It translates it into threat. And Sarai turns to Abram with the sharpness of a woman who will not share what she believes is finally hers. Cast out this servant woman and her son, she says, for the son of this servant will not share the inheritance. Genesis 21:10, paraphrased. The words slam into the moment like a door being kicked open. Abram's joy collapses into grief. His shoulders sink. His eyes move from Sarai to Ishmael, and Hagar can see it. This isn't politics to him. This is his son. But Sarai is not negotiating, and Hagar, hearing the sentence spoken out loud, feels the old wilderness return, like the desert has been waiting just beyond the tents this whole time. The feast continues for others, but for Hagar, the celebration becomes a countdown, because once again, her life is about to be pushed into the sand. That night, the camp feels colder, not because the air has changed, but because something has cracked inside the household, something that can't be stitched back with polite words. The fires burn low. Laughter from the feast fades into distant murmurs. Tents settle into darkness, and yet sleep refuses to come easily. Abram sits outside his tent, staring at the ground. He is a man of faith, yes, a man who built altars and followed a voice into unknown lands. But faith doesn't cancel fatherhood, and right now, fatherhood is breaking his heart. Inside the nearby tent, Sarai's breathing is steady. Her decision is firm. She believes she is protecting Isaac. She believes she is guarding the promise. But even when people feel justified, their choices can still wound. Hagar lies awake with Ishmael beside her. She listens for footsteps. She watches shadows shift under the tent fabric. Her hands keep finding her son's hair, smoothing it down as if she can calm the future by touching the present. Ishmael senses the tension. He isn't small anymore. He doesn't fully understand inheritance laws or covenant promises, but he can read faces, and he can feel when adults talk about him like he's a problem to be managed. "Mother," he whispers in the dark, "are we in trouble?" Hagar swallows. She doesn't want to lie. "Be quiet," she says gently, pressing her fingers to his cheek. "Try to sleep." But her own eyes stay open, and in the quiet she remembers the wilderness spring. She remembers the angel's voice. She remembers the name, God Hears. "Do you still hear now?" she wonders. Before dawn, Abram rises. The sky is still deep blue, the stars faint, the horizon barely waking. The camp is silent except for the soft shifting of animals and the distant crackle of dying embers. Abram walks toward Hagar's tent. Hagar sits up quickly when she sees his shadow. Ishmael stirs, blinking sleep from his eyes. Abram's face is heavy, not angry, not cold, just wounded. He holds something in his hands, bread and a skin of water. The supplies are practical, necessary, and that practicality is what makes the moment feel unbearable, because it means this is real. Hagar's throat tightens. "My lord," she begins, but the words collapse. She wants to plead. She wants to remind him that Ishmael is his son. She wants to ask how a man who hears God's voice can send a mother and child into the wilderness with only this. Abram looks at her, and for a second she sees the struggle in his eyes. Genesis says the matter was very distressing to Abraham because of his son, Genesis 21:11 paraphrased, and Hagar can tell. Abram's hands tremble slightly as he places the bread and water into her arms. He doesn't meet Sarai's gaze. He doesn't call the servants to escort her. He doesn't make a public announcement. He does it before sunrise, as if he's trying to spare everyone, including himself, from watching too closely. But then, quietly, Abram speaks, not as a master ordering a servant, but as a man caught between promise and pain. "I can't fight this," his voice seems to say without saying it. And more than that, he seems to be obeying a word from God, because Scripture tells us God spoke to Abraham, "Do not be distressed, listen to Sarah," and affirmed Isaac's line, while also promising to care for Ishmael, Genesis 21:12-13 paraphrased. So Abram's hands, as he sends them away, are hands that trust God even while his heart aches. Hagar stands. She ties the water skin across her shoulder. She holds the bread close like it's more than food. It's the last sign that she was once part of this household. Ishmael steps out beside her, rubbing his eyes, still half in the world of sleep, half in the world of fear. A few servants watch from a distance, pretending to be busy. No one stops them. No one argues. Sarai does not come out. Hagar doesn't look for her. She can't. She walks past the tents, past the places where her life unfolded, work, whispers, the birth of her son, the brief seasons where things felt almost stable. The ground beneath her feet is familiar, but it no longer feels like home. As the sun begins to rise, the wilderness welcomes her again, not with kindness, with openness. The land they enter is the region of Beersheba, wide, dry, and unpredictable, Genesis 21:14 paraphrased. The kind of place where your supplies matter, where your steps must be chosen, where the sky can feel too big. Ishmael stays close. At first, they walk in silence. Hagar counts the sips of water, measures the distance by the ache in her legs. She looks for landmarks, for paths, for anything that suggests direction. But fear creeps in anyway, because the wilderness doesn't care that she once met an angel here. It only cares about sun and thirst and time. And as the day stretches long, Hagar begins to realize something terrifying. This time, she isn't running away by choice. This time, she has been sent. And the question that rises in her chest is sharper than thirst. If God sees me, will he still see me out here again? The sun is merciless. By midday, the heat presses down like a heavy hand, flattening the horizon into shimmering waves. Hagar and Ishmael move slower now. Their shadows shrink beneath them. The bread is gone sooner than she expected, and the water skin grows lighter with every careful sip. Hagar tries to be wise. She searches for signs of life. Scrubby bushes, a dip in the land where moisture might hide, birds that might lead toward water. She listens for the faintest hint of movement, the smallest promise that they are not alone. But the wilderness offers only wind and distance. Ishmael's steps begin to drag. He's old enough to be brave, but young enough to feel his limits. His lips crack, his eyes squint against the glare. When he speaks, his voice is rough. "Mother, how far?" Hagar forces her face to stay calm. She cannot afford to let fear show. She squeezes his hand and points forward as if she knows exactly where they're going. "Just a little more," she says. But inside, she is counting, not miles, minutes. She counts the weight of the water skin like a judge counts evidence. She counts the way Ishmael's shoulders slump. She counts the growing silence between his questions, the way he stops asking because he's too tired to hope. By late afternoon, the water is nearly gone. Hagar shakes the skin and hears only a weak slosh. Her stomach drops. She lifts it, takes the tiniest sip, then holds it out to Ishmael. He drinks, swallowing like it's effort itself. When he hands it back, he doesn't look at her. He just stares out at the sand, as if the future is something he cannot face directly. The sky begins to soften toward evening, but the heat still lingers like a grudge. Then Ishmael stumbles. It's not dramatic. It's just one step that fails, one moment when the body says, "I can't." He drops to his knees. Hagar rushes to him, her hands trembling as she lifts his shoulders. His skin is hot. His breath comes shallow. His eyes are half-lidded, unfocused. Fear finally punches through her calm. "No," she whispers. "No, no, no." She scans the horizon again. No tents, no travelers, no stream. Only scattered bushes and dry ground. Hagar pulls Ishmael toward a small shrub, the kind that offers barely any shade, but it's something. She eases him down carefully, like she's placing the most precious thing she's ever held onto the earth itself. Ishmael leans against the bush, too weak to complain. Hagar clutches the empty water skin. She shakes it again, harder this time, as if force might create what isn't there. Nothing. Her throat tightens until breathing feels like swallowing stone. This is the moment every mother fears, the moment you realize love cannot protect someone from the laws of nature. Hagar's mind races. Run for help? But where? Keep walking, but with him? Carry him, but how far? She does the only thing she can do that won't break him further. She steps away, not because she doesn't love him, because she loves him too much to watch him fade. Genesis says she went and sat down a bow shot away, saying, "Let me not see the death of the boy." Genesis 21:16 paraphrased. Hagar collapses onto the ground at a distance. The sand is warm under her, gritty against her palms. Her shoulders shake. The strength that kept her walking has drained out like the last drops of water. And then she weeps. Not quiet tears, the kind that come from the deepest place, the kind that carry years of being used, blamed, sent away, the kind that ask questions without words. Where are you? Why did you let me come back, only to be driven out again? You said, "You see me. Do you see this?" In the distance, she can hear Ishmael's faint cries, weak, broken, small. Each sound is a knife. Hagar presses her fists to her forehead. She wants to stand up and run back to him, but she knows she can't give him water she doesn't have. She can't trade her life for his. She can only sit in the dust and love him with nothing left but grief. And yet, in that moment, when the wilderness looks like the end of the story, heaven is listening. Scripture says, God heard the voice of the boy. Genesis 21:17 paraphrased. Not the voice of Abram, not the voice of Sarai, not even first the voice of Hagar, the boy. Ishmael, God hears. The name given beside a spring now becomes the turning point in the sand, and suddenly the air shifts again, like it did long ago, like it did at the first spring. That same stillness, that same sense that the unseen world is stepping close. A voice calls, not from the horizon, not from another traveler's mouth, but from heaven. Hagar, what is the matter? Genesis 21:17 paraphrased. She jerks her head up. Her eyes search, wide with shock. The voice is firm, not harsh, steady, like a hand catching someone before they fall. Do not be afraid, it says. God has heard the boy where he is. Genesis 21:17 paraphrased. Hagar's breath catches. Where he is, not where he should be. Not where others wished him to be. Not in Abram's tent. Right here, under a bush in the wilderness. The voice continues, giving instructions like lifelines. Lift up the boy, Hold him fast, for I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 21:18 paraphrased. Hagar's hands tremble as she pushes herself up. Hope enters her chest like air after drowning. She turns toward Ishmael, ready to move, but she still doesn't see water. She still doesn't see the answer. And that's when the last line of her despair breaks apart, because God is not only speaking, he is about to open her eyes. Hagar stands fast, as if the voice from heaven has pulled her upright by the soul. Her eyes are swollen from weeping, her throat dry, her hands dusty. But fear, at least the paralyzing kind, has loosened its grip. The words still echo inside her. Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy. I will make him a great nation. Genesis 21:17-18 paraphrased. She starts walking toward Ishmael, and every step feels like a choice to believe. The boy lies where she left him, curled under the thin shade. His chest rises and falls slowly. His lips move as if he's still trying to cry, but the sound is barely there now. "Honey," Hagar whispers, kneeling beside him. She touches his forehead. Hot, too hot. She slips an arm behind his shoulders and lifts him gently, just as she was told. He sags against her, heavy, weak. Hagar's heart squeezes so tight it almost hurts to breathe. She looks around again, frantic but searching with a new kind of attention. The voice said, God heard him. The voice said, not to fear. The voice said, he would live. So where is the help? The wilderness looks the same as before. Dry ground, scattered shrubs, endless sky. It would be so easy to assume nothing has changed, that she heard a voice and still must face the same empty land. But then Scripture tells us something simple and stunning. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. Genesis 21:19 paraphrased. Opened her eyes, not the ground, not the sky. Her eyes, as if the answer was near enough all along, but grief and panic had narrowed her vision until she couldn't see it. Hagar blinks hard, almost angry at herself. And then, there, just beyond a rise in the land, half hidden by the uneven terrain, she sees it. A well, real, solid, not a mirage. The dark mouth of it waiting in the light like a doorway into mercy. A sob escapes her, this time not of despair, but of relief, so sharp it feels like pain. I see it, she breathes, more to God than to anyone. I see it. She lays Ishmael down gently for a moment, then runs the way she ran from the camp, but now with a different fire. The sand shifts under her feet. Her lungs burn, yet she doesn't slow, because hope has a speed all its own. At the well, she grabs the water skin. Her hands shake as she lowers it, fills it, pulls it up. Water sloshes against leather, music to her ears. She drinks first, not greedily, but urgently, letting life return to her body. Then she rushes back. Ishmael's eyes flutter. He looks at her as if she's far away. Here, she says, lifting his head, pressing the water skin to his mouth. He drinks. At first, small sips, then deeper. His throat works, his chest rises stronger, his hands twitch as if remembering they belong to him. Water dribbles down his chin, and Hagar laughs through tears because she does not even care about the mess. He is drinking, he is living. The wilderness hasn't changed its nature. It's still harsh, still open, still dangerous. But now, it is also the place where God answered, the place where God proved the name again. God hears. Hagar sits beside Ishmael as the sun lowers. She lets him rest with his head in her lap. She wipes his face with the edge of her garment. She watches his breathing settle. For a long time, neither of them speaks. The silence is different now, not emptiness, peace. When Ishmael finally opens his eyes fully, he looks at her with the faintest question. Mother, did you find water? Hagar nods, unable to trust her voice. Then she leans close and whispers the truth that has carried her through every turning point. God heard you. Ishmael's eyelids flutter again, but this time he doesn't drift away in weakness. He rests like someone whose body has been pulled back from the edge. Night arrives. The stars come out one by one, the same stars Abram once stared at when God spoke of countless descendants. Hagar looks up at them now and wonders at the strange way promises travel. How a covenant given to a man also sends mercy to a servant woman. How God's plan can hold Isaac and still not abandon Ishmael. Genesis says, God was with the boy as he grew. Genesis 21:20 paraphrased. That phrase is quiet, almost plain, but Hagar knows what it means. It means the well wasn't a one-time rescue. It means the wilderness won't swallow them. It means tomorrow has a door. In the days that follow, they settle in the region, learning the rhythms of survival. Ishmael becomes stronger, his limbs lean and quick, his eyes sharp. He learns to hunt. He learns the land. The desert does not make him gentle, but it makes him resilient. Hagar watches him and remembers the angel's words from years earlier about a son with a fierce spirit living free. Now she understands God did not promise an easy path. He promised a living future. And one evening, as Ishmael practices with a bow, his arms tense, his focus steady, Hagar sees something else too. Not just a survivor, a beginning, a story still unfolding. Because the wilderness did not end them. It introduced them, and the God who sees is still writing. The days after the well feel like borrowed time, time that Hagar holds carefully, like water cupped in her hands. They make a small life in the wilderness, not by comfort, but by rhythm. They learn when the air is safest to move, when the heat is too strong, when the wind carries sand that stings the eyes. Hagar becomes attentive to the smallest signs, the way birds circle, the way the ground changes color, the way a distant line of trees can mean shelter. Ishmael grows quickly. His body stretches taller, his shoulders broaden, his hands become steady. He's not a child who clings to tents anymore. He is becoming a wilderness man, alert, independent, quick to adapt. Genesis says he became an archer, Genesis 21:20 paraphrased. And Hagar sees it in the way he holds a bow, not like a toy, but like a tool that can mean the difference between hunger and food. At first, she is afraid of what the wilderness might do to him. Not violence. Hagar has seen enough harshness without needing more. But she fears the wilderness might harden his heart, make him bitter, make him believe the world is only a place where the strong survive and the weak are discarded. Yet something else begins to grow in Ishmael too. Not bitterness, awareness, because he remembers the day he almost died. And even if he can't put the theology into words, his spirit carries a truth that shapes him. Somehow, we were heard. He doesn't speak about it often. He doesn't sit by the fire and preach. But Hagar notices that when he drinks water, he doesn't take it for granted. When he eats, he offers his mother the first portion. When they hear distant travelers, he moves between her and the unknown, protective without being cruel. One night, after Ishmael returns with food, Hagar looks at him in the firelight and sees the outline of a man forming inside the boy she once carried across the sand. And her heart aches, not with fear now, but with memory, because she remembers Abram. She remembers the camp. She remembers the moment Abram spoke the name Ishmael aloud. She remembers the tenderness Abram tried to hide. She remembers that her son is not only hers, he is also Abram's blood. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, Hagar wonders if Abram ever looks out at the wilderness and thinks of them. Does he regret sending them? Does he pray for Ishmael? Does he remember the boy's laugh? Hagar doesn't let herself stay in those questions too long. They can become poison if you sip them daily. But she does let herself remember one thing. God's promise didn't break when Abram's household rejected them. God's promise followed them into the desert. And now Hagar begins to make a decision that is both practical and symbolic. She looks for a wife for Ishmael. In the world they live in, marriage is not just romance. It's survival. It's alliance. It's future. It's the building of a household that can endure. Genesis tells us Hagar took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Genesis 21:21, paraphrased. Egypt, the place Hagar came from, the place of her beginnings. It's as if, in the middle of wilderness life, Hagar reaches back and ties her son to roots that won't be erased. She does not do this to reject Abram's world. She does it to steady Ishmael's identity, to remind him, you are not only what they called you in the camp. You are not only the servant son. You come from somewhere. You belong to something. When the girl arrives, young, careful, eyes bright with uncertainty, Hagar watches Ishmael meet her. He's not awkward like a small boy anymore. He stands taller, more composed, and yet there is gentleness in the way he speaks. Hagar sees the possibility of grandchildren. She sees tents of their own someday. She sees laughter returning, not as mockery, but as life. Still, the wilderness is not the only stage where this story moves. Far away, Abram's household continues. Isaac grows. Promises deepen. Decisions ripple outward like waves. And in the space between these two sons, one born from human planning, one born from divine timing, God is shaping something bigger than any one household can control. Hagar does not have all the details. She does not sit with scrolls and charts mapping history. She only knows what she has lived. She ran once because she was mistreated. She returned because God spoke. She was sent away because humans feared. She survived because God heard. That pattern becomes a testimony. And there's something else, too, something quiet but powerful. Hagar realizes she is no longer simply a woman reacting to other people's choices. She is building. She is guiding. She is raising a son who will become a nation. The God who found her by a spring did not only rescue her for her own sake, he planted a future inside her story. One evening, as Ishmael practices with his bow under the pink-orange sky, Hagar sits and watches him for a long time. The boy draws the string back, breathes out, and releases. The arrow cuts the air cleanly and strikes its mark. Ishmael turns and smiles, quick, bright, genuine, and Hagar smiles back, feeling something she hasn't felt in years. Not just relief, not insight, but faith, because the same God who opened her eyes to a well is opening a path for her son. And the wilderness, once her place of exile, is becoming the place where a new beginning takes root. But the story is not finished, because somewhere beyond the desert lines, Abram's life is moving toward another test, and another moment when heaven will speak. And when heaven speaks, it will touch the legacy of both sons. Far beyond Hagar's firelight, another fire is being prepared. In Abraham's camp, years have kept moving like a river, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden. Isaac is no longer the fragile miracle of a newborn. He is growing into a boy with questions, laughter, and trust in his father's voice. And one day, that voice is tested. Scripture says God called to Abraham, and Abraham answered, "Here I am." Genesis 22:1, paraphrased. The words are simple, but the moment is anything but, because the instruction that follows is heavy, so heavy that Abraham's whole world seems to tilt under it. God asked him to take Isaac, the beloved son of promise, and go to a mountain God will show him. Genesis 22:2, paraphrased. We won't linger on fear. This story is not meant to shock. It's meant to reveal something deeper. What happens when faith is pressed, when trust is asked to walk where logic cannot lead. Early the next morning, Abraham rises. He doesn't announce the struggle in his heart. He simply prepares wood, gathers supplies, and calls Isaac to come with him. They leave the camp behind, step by step, moving toward a horizon that neither of them fully understands. For 3 days they travel. 3 days is a long time to carry a question you cannot answer. 3 days of looking at your son's face and wondering what obedience will cost. 3 days of silence that isn't empty. It's full of prayer without words. On the third day, Abraham sees the place in the distance. Genesis 22:4, paraphrased. He tells the servants to stay behind, and then he and Isaac walk forward alone, father and son, toward the mountain. Isaac carries the wood. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. And somewhere on the path, Isaac speaks the line that makes the air tighten. Father, where is the lamb? Genesis 22:7, paraphrased. Abraham swallows the ache. Then he answers with a sentence that holds his faith together like a thread. God himself will provide. Genesis 22:8, paraphrased. Those words do not explain everything, but they keep him walking. At the top of the mountain, Abraham arranges the wood. He moves slowly, carefully, as if each motion is a prayer, and just as the moment reaches its breaking point, God interrupts it. Do not lay your hand on the boy, the voice says, Genesis 22:12, paraphrased. Abraham freezes. Breath returns. Then he looks up, and there, caught nearby, is a ram, Genesis 22:13, paraphrased. Provision, a substitute, a reminder that God's tests are not about cruelty, but about trust, and about revealing that he is the one who provides. Abraham names the place with a truth that echoes through generations. The Lord will provide. Genesis 22:14, paraphrased. Now here's where this touches Hagar's story, because on that mountain, God renews the promise to Abraham. Descendants, blessing, a future larger than one family's imagination. Genesis 22:16-18, paraphrased. And the shape of that future is wide enough to hold both sons. Isaac, the covenant line of promise, and Ishmael, the son God heard in the wilderness. Hagar may never hear the details of Abraham's mountain test. She may never know the name Abraham gave that place. But the same God who stopped Abraham's hand is the God who opened Hagar's eyes to a well. Different scenes, same heart, provision, and somewhere in the desert, as Ishmael learns to become a man, Hagar begins to understand something that steadies her in the night. God's care is not limited by human decisions. God's mercy is not boxed in by family conflict. The God who provides on a mountain is also the God who hears under a bush, and that means the story of Hagar and Ishmael is not a side note. It is a living proof that when heaven speaks a name, God hears. He intends to keep saying it again and again until even the wilderness feels like a place where hope can survive. Hagar's life does not become easy. It becomes anchored. There is a difference. Easy means the desert stops being the desert. Anchored means the desert is still hot, still wide, still unpredictable. But your heart is no longer drifting without direction. After the day God opened her eyes to the well, Hagar learns to live with a steady awareness that changes everything. Help can be near, even when you can't see it yet. Ishmael grows into his strength. He learns how to read the sky. He learns how to track animals without wasting energy. He learns to find shade where others see only scrub. He becomes the kind of young man the wilderness shapes, lean, alert, quick to act. But what surprises Hagar most is this. He doesn't grow into a man who despises life. He grows into a man who respects it. When Ishmael takes a life to eat, he does it with seriousness, not with cruelty. When he returns with food, he shares first. When they encounter other travelers, he keeps watch, but does not rush into hostility. The angel's description from years ago about a son who would live free and strong begins to make sense, but not in the way Hagar once feared. Strong does not have to mean heartless. Free does not have to mean alone. Hagar, too, changes. At first she thought survival would shrink her into a quiet shadow, just a woman avoiding danger. But slowly she realizes she has become something else, a keeper of memory, a storyteller of mercy, a mother whose voice matters in shaping a nation's beginning. In the evenings, when the fire burns low and the stars come out, Ishmael sometimes asks about the past. Not always directly. Sometimes it's a small question disguised as casual curiosity. "Why did we leave Abraham's camp?" he asks one night, eyes fixed on the flames. Hagar feels the old ache rise up. She could answer with anger. She could poison her son's heart with bitterness. It would be easy. Bitterness is a fast language. The wilderness teaches it quickly. But Hagar pauses. She thinks of the angel. She thinks of the spring. She thinks of the voice from heaven. "Do not be afraid." And she chooses a harder truth. "People were afraid," she says quietly. "They wanted to protect what they loved. And sometimes fear makes people do painful things." Ishmael's jaw tightens. "Did they not love me?" Hagar reaches out and rests her hand on his arm. "Your father loved you," she says, "but he was torn. And your name is proof of something bigger than their choices." Ishmael looks at her, questioning. "God hears," Hagar says, enunciating each word like a stone placed carefully in a foundation. "He heard you, he heard me, and he did not let us disappear." The fire pops, sparks rise and vanish in the dark. Ishmael's face softens, not because the past stops hurting, but because a deeper identity settles in. Not rejected, not thrown away. He is heard. In time, Ishmael's household begins to expand. Through marriage, through friendships, through the natural gathering of those who live in open lands, a small community forms. They are not a palace people. They are not a city people. They are wilderness people, moving, adapting, building with what they have. And Hagar watches it grow with a mixture of amazement and humility, because she remembers how close she came to dying alone. Now she sees laughter around fires. She hears babies cry in the night. She watches Ishmael teach younger boys how to hold a bow, not with arrogance, but with patient instruction. And in those moments, the promise doesn't feel abstract anymore. "I will make him into a great nation." Genesis 21:18 paraphrased. That line becomes visible in small beginnings. But there is also a shadow on the horizon, an emotional shadow, not a threat. Hagar knows Isaac is growing too. She wonders what kind of man he will become. She wonders if he remembers Ishmael at all, if he ever asks, "Where did my brother go?" She wonders if Sarai ever feels a sting of guilt, or if the sweetness of her miracle has covered it. Hagar doesn't have answers, yet she does have a lesson the wilderness carved into her bones. You can't control what people do, but you can control what you carry forward. So Hagar carries faith forward, not the polished kind that pretends life is neat, the tested kind, the kind born in tears and dust, and a voice that called her name. And that faith shapes her son, because Ishmael learned something many never learn. God is not only present in tents of wealth and promise, he is also present under bushes of desperation. He is not only God of the powerful, he is God of the cast out. One morning, as the sun rises and colors the sand in soft gold, Hagar stands outside her small dwelling and watches Ishmael walk toward the horizon with his bow on his back. He turns and lifts a hand, a silent promise that he will return. Hagar breathes in and whispers, not for him to hear, but for heaven, "Thank you for seeing." And as if in answer, the wind moves gently across the land, quiet, steady, like a reminder. The God who sees, still sees. The God who hears, still hears. And the story keeps unfolding toward a day when Hagar's life, once hidden in the margins, will be remembered as a witness. When humans push someone into the wilderness, God can meet them there and turn exile into beginnings. Seasons change in the wilderness the way they do everywhere, quietly, then all at once. One year the rains come a little stronger, and the shrubs bloom with tiny color. Another year the wind stays harsh, and the land feels thin and stingy. Hagar learns not to measure life by comfort, but by faithfulness, daily bread, daily water, daily strength. Ishmael is a man now, not just tall, formed. His voice is deeper, His gaze is steady. His hands know work, and his shoulders carry responsibility. Around him, a small community has grown. Tents, families, children laughing in the dust. Hagar watches it like someone watching a seed turn into a tree. And still, the past follows them like a distant echo, not as a chain, but as a question. One evening, as the sky turns violet and the first stars appear, a traveler approaches. He's not rushing like someone chased, but he's moving with purpose, like he has news that belongs to someone important. Ishmael meets him first, bow in hand, not threatening, but alert. The traveler raises both hands, showing peace. "I come from the south," he says, "from the settlements near Abraham." At the name, Hagar's heart tightens. Even after all these years, Abraham's name still pulls on something deep, like a cord tied to an old life. The traveler is given water. He drinks, then speaks carefully. "Sarah has died," he says at last. The words land softly, and yet they hit hard. Hagar sits down without meaning to. Her mind flashes Sarah's tent, the sharp eyes, the authority, the pain, the day she was sent away, the joy that turned to fear, the sentence, "Cast out the servant and her son." Hagar has carried anger like a stone before, but time has smoothed its sharp edges. Now, hearing of Sarah's death, she feels something more complicated, not triumph, not revenge, a strange, quiet sadness. Because Sarah's story was also heavy. Years of waiting, years of shame, years of trying to control what she couldn't change. Hagar remembers the way Sarah's face looked when she finally held Isaac, like a woman who had been thirsty for decades and finally drank. Hagar lowers her eyes and whispers, almost surprised by her own words, "May God have mercy." Ishmael looks at her. "She drove us out," he says, not bitter, just factual. "Why mercy?" Hagar takes a slow breath. "Because," she says, "mercy is what kept us alive." The traveler continues. He speaks of Abraham buying a burial place in the land, Genesis 23, 19, and 20, paraphrased, a field, a cave, something permanent, a reminder that even people of promise still face the ordinary endings of human life. That night, Hagar lies awake, staring at the stars. She thinks about graves, about what people leave behind. She thinks about promises, how they outlast bodies. She thinks about the angel who met her at a spring and called her name as if she mattered to heaven. And she realizes something that steadies her. Sarah's death does not rewrite Hagar's pain, but it does invite Hagar to release what pain tried to make permanent. In the morning, Ishmael comes to her quietly. "Do you want to go there?" he asks. Hagar studies his face. He is asking as a son, but also as a man guarding his mother. "I don't know," she admits. Scripture doesn't tell us Hagar returned for Sarah's burial. It doesn't record a reunion, or words exchanged, or tears shared. The Bible is sometimes silent on what our hearts wish it would describe, but the silence itself carries a lesson. Not every wound gets a public resolution. Not every injustice gets an apology. And yet, God can still heal. Hagar looks at Ishmael and places her hand on his arm. "Listen," she says gently. "We will not chase old battles, but we will remember who we are." Ishmael nods. Hagar continues, voice calm. "Your name is still your testimony. God hears." Genesis 16:11, 21:17, paraphrased. When people talk about Abraham's house, they will speak of Isaac, and that is God's plan. But they will also speak of you, because God promised you a future too. Genesis 21:13, 18, paraphrased. Ishmael's jaw tightens, not with anger, but with resolve. That day, he walks among his people with a steadier confidence, not competing with Isaac, not chasing what wasn't given, simply carrying what God did give. And Hagar feels lighter, not because the past disappears, but because she finally understands what her story has been saying all along. You may be pushed out by humans, but you are never pushed out of God's sight. And somewhere far away, Abraham continues aging under the same sky, moving toward his own final chapter, a chapter that will, in time, bring both sons close again, if only for a moment, because God's story has a way of weaving threads back together, not always to erase the past, but to prove that mercy is stronger than it. News travels slowly across open land, but it always arrives. A few seasons after the word of Sarah's death, another message begins to move like wind through the region. Abraham is old, very old. His hair is white like desert salt. His steps are slower. His voice still carries authority, but his body carries the weight of years. Hagar hears it in fragments first. Passing traders, a shepherd who once worked near Abraham's wells, a traveler with dust on his cloak and a careful tone. Then one evening, the message becomes clear. Abraham has died, the traveler says. He lived a long life, and he was gathered to his people. Hagar's breath catches. She expected the news someday. She knew it would come, but knowing doesn't soften the moment when it finally lands. For a long time, she says nothing. She just stares at the fire. The flames flicker, and in the light, she sees memories. Abram's hands placing bread and water into her arms at dawn, his eyes wet with grief he couldn't show. Abram holding Ishmael as a newborn and speaking the name she was given in the wilderness, Ishmael. God hears. Hagar's chest tightens with something that feels like mourning and also like unfinished questions. Ishmael sits across from her, silent. He is a man now, not a boy. He has his own tent, his own responsibilities, his own people who look to him. But the news pulls him back to something he never fully stopped carrying, the fact that Abraham was his father. After a long pause, Ishmael speaks. "Will we go?" Hagar looks up. "To the burial?" Ishmael nods once. His eyes are steady, but there's tension in his jaw. "He is my father," he says quietly. Hagar holds his gaze. This is the moment where bitterness could take control. She could say, "He sent us away." She could remind him of thirst, of the bush, of tears. She could insist that Abraham chose Isaac, and so Isaac should carry the burden alone. But Hagar thinks of mercy again. She thinks of how God heard the boy. She thinks of how God provided a well. She thinks of how survival didn't come from revenge, but from grace. So she nods. "Go," she says softly. "Honor him." And Ishmael prepares. He doesn't travel with a crowd. He doesn't arrive with a boast. He goes with a few trusted men, enough for safety, not enough to make a statement. The wilderness is still the wilderness, and wisdom matters. Hagar watches him leave, and her heart feels strange, proud, protective, and somehow peaceful. Days later, Ishmael returns. He is quiet at first, like someone who has stepped into a sacred space and doesn't want to break it with quick words. He sits by the fire, then finally speaks. "I saw Isaac," he says. Hagar's fingers tighten slightly around the cloth in her hands. She keeps her face calm. "And?" Ishmael exhales. "He is different than I imagined." He pauses. Not weak, not arrogant, just a man carrying grief. Hagar listens, letting her son speak at his own pace. Ishmael continues, voice low. "We buried our father together, side by side." Genesis records it with quiet simplicity. Isaac and Ishmael buried him. Genesis 25:9 paraphrased. 2 sons, 2 lines of story, one father placed into the earth. Ishmael stares into the flames. "We didn't speak much," he admits. "What could we say? Too much happened. Too many years." Hagar nods slowly. She understands. Some gaps are not crossed by a single conversation. "Did he look at you?" she asks carefully. Ishmael's eyes lift. "Yes," he says. "And for a moment, it felt like he was seeing me for who I am, not for what I represent." Hagar swallows. That is all she ever wanted for him. Not inheritance, not status, not a seat in the main tent. Just to be seen, to be recognized as a son, as a person, as someone God heard. Ishmael shifts closer to the fire. "Mother," he says, "I don't think he hated me. I think he feared conflict. He feared losing the promise. He feared Sarah's pain." Hagar studies her son, moved by the maturity in his words. The wilderness has made him strong, yes, but it has also made him thoughtful. "Fear makes people small," she says quietly, "even good people." Ishmael nods. He looks out into the dark, where the stars hang like silent witnesses. "But God," he says, "God did not make me small." The words settle between them like a blessing. In that moment, Hagar feels the full arc of her story, how she began as a servant, became a mother, became a runaway, became a survivor, became the matriarch of a growing people. And she realizes something else. God didn't just rescue her from the wilderness. He used the wilderness to shape her legacy. The burial of Abraham doesn't erase the pain of separation. It doesn't rewrite what happened between tents. But it proves that God's promises can run on parallel tracks without collapsing into hatred. Isaac and Ishmael can stand near each other without destroying each other. They can honor the same father without competing for the same future. And for Hagar, that is a kind of quiet miracle too, because the God who sees not only sees the abandoned and the grieving, he also sees the possibility of peace, even when history has given every reason for bitterness. Hagar looks at Ishmael and smiles gently. "You went," she says. "You honored him." Ishmael nods. "And I came back," he replies. Hagar's eyes soften. "Yes," she whispers, "you came back." And as the fire crackles, as the desert night wraps around their small camp, Hagar understands the story that began with running has become a story of returning, not to Abraham's tents, but to identity, to purpose, to the unshakable truth written into her son's name. God hears. After Abraham's burial, something settles in the air like dust after a long caravan passes. For years, Hagar lived with the feeling that her story was always reacting to someone else's decisions. Sarah decided. Abraham obeyed. The household shifted. The wilderness swallowed the leftovers. But now, with Abraham gone and Ishmael grown, Hagar feels a new kind of quiet. No one is pushing her anymore. That doesn't mean life becomes soft. The desert still demands wisdom, but it means her heart is no longer waiting for permission to exist. Ishmael's community continues to expand. Children run between tents. Older men teach younger ones how to move safely through open land. Women gather water and share stories that keep identity alive. Hagar becomes something like a living landmark, not because she is famous in the way kings are famous, but because her story has weight. People ask her about the early days. They ask about the God of Abraham. They ask how she survived, and Hagar learns to answer without bitterness. She tells them about the spring in the wilderness, about the voice that called her by name, about the moment she discovered that heaven sees the ones humans overlook. "You are the God who sees me," Genesis 16:13 paraphrased. That phrase becomes more than memory. It becomes her message. At first, some listeners are surprised. They think God speaks only to patriarchs, only to the powerful, only to those inside the main story. But Hagar is proof that God's attention does not follow human rank. He follows need. He follows cries. He follows the unseen. One evening, a young mother comes to Hagar, eyes red from weeping. Her child has been sick. Her husband is away. The night feels too long. Hagar doesn't give a speech. She sits beside her, wraps an arm around her shoulders, and whispers something she learned the hard way. God hears, not as a slogan, as a lifeline. The woman asks, "Will he hear me? Even me?" Hagar nods slowly. "He heard my boy under a bush," she says. "He heard me when I had no words left." The mother's breathing steadies. This is how Hagar's story keeps moving, not through grand announcements, but through quiet transfers of hope. Meanwhile, Ishmael carries leadership with growing strength. He doesn't chase Isaac's inheritance. He doesn't build his identity around what he lost. He builds around what God promised. And Hagar watches him and realizes her son's greatest victory is not survival. It is freedom from resentment. Because resentment is a second wilderness, one inside the soul, and Ishmael has learned to live free. On a clear night, Hagar walks outside alone and looks up at the stars. The same stars Abraham once counted, the same stars that once seemed to belong only to someone else's promise. Now they feel different, not stolen, not distant, shared. Hagar breathes in the cool air and speaks a simple prayer. God who sees, thank you for seeing. Then she smiles, because she knows something she didn't know when she first ran. Sometimes the wilderness is not your end. Sometimes it is where God meets you, names you, and turns your tears into a testimony. Time does what it always does. It keeps moving. Hagar feels it in her bones first. In mornings, when standing up takes a little longer. In evenings, when the cold settles deeper. In the way her hands, once quick and strong, now move with careful patience. She isn't afraid of aging, not anymore. She has stared at the edge of death before, under a desert bush, with nothing but dust and tears. After that, every extra day feels like undeserved mercy. Ishmael notices too. He speaks to her with more gentleness now. He brings her water without being asked. He makes sure her tent is placed where shade lasts longer. He listens when she repeats stories, because he understands she isn't repeating them by accident. She's passing them down. One afternoon, as the wind runs low and the air is calm, Ishmael sits beside Hagar outside her tent. Children's laughter drifts from nearby. The community feels alive, busy, grounded. Ishmael clears his throat. "Mother," he says, "tell me again about the angel." Hagar's eyes lift. They soften. "You know the story," she says. "I do," Ishmael answers, "but I want to hear it the way you heard it." So Hagar tells him. She speaks of running, how the camp felt like a tightening rope. She speaks of the spring, that small miracle in the sand. She speaks of the presence that made the air still. And she speaks of the moment the angel said her name, Hagar, as if heaven had been waiting for her to stop long enough to be found. She repeats the question that changed her. Where have you come from, and where are you going? Genesis 16:8, paraphrased. Ishmael listens closely, like a man storing water for a future drought. Then Hagar tells the part that still surprises her most. "He gave you your name," she says, touching Ishmael's hand. "He said, 'Call him Ishmael.'" God hears, Genesis 16:11, paraphrased. Ishmael's jaw tightens, not with anger, but with emotion he rarely shows. "So," he murmurs, "even before I was born, God heard me." Hagar nods. "Yes." Ishmael looks out toward the horizon. "Then why?" he asks quietly. "Did we suffer at all?" Hagar doesn't rush the answer. She has learned not to insult pain with quick sentences. Finally, she speaks. "Because people make choices from fear, and because the world is broken in ways we can't fix with our hands." She pauses, then adds, "But suffering didn't get the last word." Ishmael turns back to her. "God did." Hagar smiles because he understands. That is the inheritance she wanted most for him. Not tents, not cattle, not a name on Abraham's land. A heart that knows God is real even in exile. As evening approaches, Ishmael stands and offers her his arm. She takes it, and together they walk slowly through the community. People greet Hagar with respect. Younger women watch her like you watch someone who survived what you fear. Men nod to her, not because she is powerful, but because she is proven. Hagar feels the strange joy of it, being valued not for what she produces, but for who she has become. That night, after the camp quiets, Hagar lies down and listens to the sounds around her, the soft breathing of life, the distant call of night birds, the faint crackle of a dying fire, and she thinks of two phrases that carried her through everything. God sees. God hears. She whispers them like a blessing over the sleeping tents, because she knows something now that she didn't know in Sarah's house. Your story can start with being used and still end with being chosen to carry hope into the places everyone else forgets. There comes a point in every life when the loud events fade and what remains is meaning. For Hagar, the loud events were obvious. The tent of Sarah, the wilderness spring, the second exile, the bush, the well that saved her boy. Those moments were like thunder, impossible to ignore. But now, in her later years, meaning arrives more like morning light, quiet, steady, spreading. A young man from the community comes to her one day with a question. He is strong, confident, and yet his eyes carry worry. "My wife cannot have children," he says softly. "People are talking. I feel ashamed." Hagar looks at him for a long moment. She remembers Sarah's ache. She remembers how waiting can twist the heart. She remembers how pressure can make good people choose harmful plans. Hagar doesn't scold him. She doesn't give him a speech full of rules. She simply tells him what she has learned. Do not let shame make your choices for you. The young man swallows. Then what do I do? Hagar answers with a truth that is both simple and costly. Bring your pain to God before you bring it to people. Because Hagar knows what happens when people try to force outcomes. She lived inside someone else's forced outcome. She carried the consequences in her own body. Then she adds, God's timing can be slow, but it is not empty. The man nods, taking the words like water. After he leaves, Hagar sits alone for a while, reflecting on how her story holds multiple mirrors. It mirrors Sarah's struggle with waiting. It mirrors Abraham's struggle with obedience. It mirrors Ishmael's struggle with identity. But most of all, it mirrors God's character. Because when Hagar was unseen, God saw her. When Ishmael was fading, God heard him. When the future looked closed, God opened her eyes. Genesis doesn't give us long speeches from Hagar. It gives us moments, and those moments preach louder than many sermons. Hagar begins to share them intentionally now, not to build her reputation, but to keep the community grounded. She gathers the women one evening and tells them about the well, how the answer was near, but grief made her blind. She tells them, sometimes you don't need a new miracle. You need new sight. Another day she talks to young boys, watching them play with bows. She points to Ishmael, now a leader, and says, strength without mercy becomes a curse, but strength guided by God becomes protection. And slowly, Hagar's influence grows beyond her household, not because she conquers land, because she plants wisdom. As the sun sets one night, Hagar walks outside her tent and looks toward the distant horizon where Abraham's camp once was. She doesn't feel bitterness now. She feels something more mature, gratitude that God wrote her into his story at all. She whispers a prayer that sounds like a closing of a circle. God who sees, God who hears, keep my people. Then she turns back toward the tents where children sleep, where Ishmael's line continues, where life keeps multiplying, just as promised. And in that quiet, Hagar understands the deepest lesson of her whole journey. Being cast out did not mean being abandoned. It meant being carried in a different direction. Sometimes God's mercy doesn't bring you back to the place that hurt you. Sometimes it leads you forward into a new beginning you couldn't imagine, until he opened your eyes. In the desert, legacy isn't carved in stone, it's carried in stories. One morning, Hagar wakes to the sound of children arguing outside her tent. 2 boys, both stubborn, both convinced they're right. Their voices rise, then sharpen. A small crowd gathers, amused at first, then tense as the boys shove each other. Ishmael steps in quickly, separating them with firm hands. Enough, he says. His voice isn't loud, but it lands like a boundary. The boys glare. Pride refuses to sit down. Hagar watches from the shade, and something in her stirs. Not anger, recognition. She has seen this before, not in children's hands, but in grown hearts, in Sarah's jealousy, in Abraham's silence, in the way fear can turn family into factions. Ishmael brings the boys to Hagar. "Mother," he says, "tell them something they will remember." The boys look down, embarrassed but still boiling inside. Hagar studies them for a long moment, then speaks softly. "You want to know what the wilderness does?" she asks. They blink, confused. "It exposes what's already inside you," Hagar continues. "If pride is inside you, the wilderness makes it louder. If bitterness is inside you, the wilderness makes it heavier. But if you carry faith, it becomes a shelter." One boy mutters, "We weren't in the wilderness." Hagar's eyes narrow gently, not harsh, just clear. "You will be," she says, "not always with sand, sometimes with sickness, sometimes with loss, sometimes with shame. Everyone meets a wilderness." The boys fall quiet. Hagar leans forward. "When I was in mine, I thought I was alone, but God met me by a spring. He called my name." Genesis 16:7-8, paraphrased. She taps her chest lightly. "That changed me." The boys glance at each other, listening now. "And when my son was dying," she says, voice steady, "God heard him under a bush." Genesis 21:17, paraphrased. She looks at Ishmael, then back to the boys. "That changed our future." One boy whispers, "So, God heard you?" Hagar nods. "He heard us, and he opened my eyes to water I couldn't see." Genesis 21:19, paraphrased. She lets the silence do its work. Then she adds, "So here's what you do when you feel anger rising. You ask God to open your eyes, because most fights begin when people feel unseen." The boys swallow. Their shoulders lower a little. Ishmael kneels beside them. "Apologize," he says simply. They do, awkward, imperfect, but real. As the crowd disperses, Ishmael stays seated near Hagar. "You're building them," he says quietly. Hagar smiles. "That's what God did with us," she replies. "He didn't just rescue us, he shaped us." Ishmael looks out across the tents, the children, the families, the small beginnings that now feel like a nation in motion. "And if we forget," he says, "we'll become like the ones who hurt you." Hagar's smile fades into seriousness. "Yes," she says, "that is why we remember." That night, Hagar watches the stars and whispers the name that began as a promise and became a lifeline. Ishmael, God hears. And she understands her role more clearly than ever, not just to survive the wilderness, but to teach others how to walk through it, with clean hands, humble hearts, and eyes that stay open to mercy. The older Hagar becomes, the more she understands a strange truth. Some battles don't end. They transform, not into shouting or open conflict, those years are behind her, but into quiet temptations, the temptation to rehearse old wounds, to define herself by rejection, to let the past write the script of the future. And every time that temptation rises, Hagar returns to the same two memories like a compass, a spring in the wilderness, a well that was there, but unseen. One evening, a small group of travelers arrives near Ishmael's tents. They aren't hostile. They're tired. Their clothes are dusty, their faces worn. They ask permission to rest, to share firelight, to trade news. Ishmael welcomes them cautiously, offering water first, because desert people know water is sacred. As they sit, one traveler recognizes a name. "Ishmael," he says slowly, "son of Abraham?" The air tightens, not with danger, just with old history. Ishmael doesn't deny it. "Yes." The traveler nods, then looks at Hagar. "And you? You are Hagar?" Hagar feels the weight of being remembered. For years, she was invisible. Now, her name has traveled. "Yes," she answers. The traveler hesitates, then speaks a line that could have been a spark in dry grass. "In Abraham's camp, some say you were cast out because you were trouble." Hagar's heart gives a small, sharp pulse. She has heard versions of this before. Stories change in people's mouths. The powerful tend to rewrite events until they sound clean. For a moment, the old anger tries to rise, but Hagar looks at Ishmael first, her son, her answered cry, and chooses wisdom over reaction. People say many things, she replies calmly, but God knows the truth. The traveler studies her. And what is the truth? Hagar takes a slow breath. She could defend herself. She could explain Sarah's jealousy. She could expose Abraham's silence. She could list every unfair detail. Instead, she gives a testimony. I ran once, she says, because I felt crushed, and God met me in the wilderness and spoke my name. Genesis 16:7-8, paraphrased. She pauses, letting the fire crackle fill the gap. Later, when my boy was dying, God heard him and opened my eyes to a well. Genesis 21:17-19, paraphrased. The travelers exchange looks. Some are skeptical, some are moved. One asks, why would God care about you? Hagar's gaze stays steady. That is the question I once asked without words, she says, and God answered by seeing me. She quotes it softly, almost like a line carved into her life. You are the God who sees me. Genesis 16:13, paraphrased. Silence falls, not awkward, holy. Then the traveler lowers his head. Forgive me, he says quietly. I repeated a story I didn't understand. Hagar nods once. It's easy to repeat what people say, she replies. Harder to honor what God did. After the travelers sleep, Ishmael sits beside his mother. You didn't defend yourself, he says. Hagar smiles faintly. I did, she answers, just not the way you expected. Ishmael looks puzzled. I defended the most important thing, Hagar says, tapping her chest. Not my reputation, my testimony. Ishmael's eyes soften. He nods slowly, because he understands now what Hagar learned years ago. If your identity depends on people's opinions, you will always be thirsty. But if your identity rests in God's attention, you can live free. That night, as the camp settles, Hagar lies down and listens to the desert wind, and she realizes something that feels like completion. The wilderness tried to make her story small. People tried to reduce her to a mistake. But God turned her into a witness. And a witness doesn't need everyone to agree. A witness only needs to speak what is true. God sees. God hears. And even in exile, He provides. The desert teaches you what lasts, not the things you can buy, not the titles people give, not the stories people spread. The desert strips life down until only the essentials remain: water, shelter, trust, and the names you live by. For Hagar, two names have held everything together: the God who sees, the God who hears. But now, in the later stretch of her life, another lesson rises, one that feels less dramatic, yet just as holy. Sometimes God's greatest gift is not changing your circumstances, but changing what you carry inside them. Hagar begins to notice the younger women in the camp. They are strong, capable, busy with children and food and daily survival. But in their eyes, she sees the same storms she once carried: fear of being replaced, fear of being ignored, fear of not being enough. One woman, tired and sharp-tongued, snaps at another near the water jars. The words aren't violent, but they sting. The other woman's face falls, and she turns away quietly. Hagar watches and feels the familiar ache of household tension. It's different faces now, different tents, but the same human pattern. Pressure creates conflict. Insecurity becomes cruelty. Pain spills outward. That evening, Hagar asks Ishmael to gather the women for a simple meal. Nothing formal, just bread, dates, and a shared fire. They arrive curious. Some sit close, some sit back, arms folded, guarded. Hagar doesn't begin with accusation. She begins with story. I lived in a house where pain became harshness, she says gently, not because everyone was evil, but because everyone was afraid. The women listen. One woman waited so long for a promise, Hagar continues, that her waiting turned into pressure, and that pressure turned into control. A few women glance at each other. They know exactly what she's describing, even without names. Hagar keeps her voice steady. And a servant, an outsider, became the place where all that pressure landed. Silence. Then Hagar looks around the circle. I tell you this, she says, because we are building something here, and if we build it on fear, we will injure each other the way I was injured. One woman speaks up, defensive. But what if someone takes what is mine? Hagar nods. That fear is real, she says, but fear is a bad master. It makes you grab, and grabbing makes you blind. She pauses, then adds, I was blind once, blind with panic, and God opened my eyes to a well that was already near. Genesis 21:19, paraphrased. The women breathe differently at that line, like it touches something deep. So what do we do? Another asks, quieter now. Hagar answers with the kind of wisdom that only comes from surviving both people and wilderness. Before you speak in anger, ask God to open your eyes. Before you accuse, ask God to show you what you can't see. Before you push someone away, ask God if you are repeating an old sin. Then she says the sentence she wishes someone had said in Sarah's tent years ago, do not turn another woman into your enemy. Some eyes fill with tears. Some women look down, because they know how easy it is to do exactly that. Hagar softens her tone further. God saw me, she says, not because I was perfect, but because I was desperate, and He will see you too. She quotes the words that changed her life. You are the God who sees me. Genesis 16:13, paraphrased. Then she adds, and He hears your cries before you turn them into weapons. Genesis 21:17, paraphrased. After the gathering, the women begin to change, slowly, imperfectly, but visibly, not because Hagar forced them, because she gave them another way to carry pressure. In the days that follow, Hagar hears fewer sharp words near the water jars. She sees apologies happen quicker. She watches younger mothers help instead of compete, and she realizes something beautiful. Her story is healing others, not by making her famous, by making her useful. Ishmael notices too. One night, he sits beside her and says, You're shaping the camp more than I do. Hagar smiles. You lead with strength, she replies. I lead with memory. Ishmael nods, and with mercy. Hagar looks up at the stars, and her heart feels full in a quiet way. This is what she never expected when she first ran into the wilderness, that her pain would become a well for others, that her exile would produce wisdom, that the God who met her alone would use her to keep many from becoming alone. The desert wind passes through the tents like a breath. Hagar closes her eyes and whispers, not as desperation now, but as gratitude. God who sees, keep opening our eyes. God who hears, keep softening our hearts. And in that prayer, her story reaches toward its final lesson. God's mercy doesn't only rescue you, it makes you a shelter. The last chapters of a life rarely arrive with trumpets. They arrive with quieter things, slower steps, longer rests, deeper listening. Hagar can feel the end of her journey drawing near, not with fear, but with a kind of settled knowing. Her tent is still in the wilderness. The wind still moves across the land. Children still laugh. Fires still crackle at night. But Hagar is different now than the girl who once stood silent in Sarah's tent. She has become a woman who knows God personally. One evening, Ishmael sits beside her as the sun drops low, painting the horizon in soft gold. He doesn't speak right away. He just sits, like a son who finally understands the value of presence. Hagar reaches for his hand. It's strong now, scarred in small places, shaped by work and survival. The hand of a man who has become what God said he would become, free, resilient, and alive. I remember you under the bush, Hagar whispers. Ishmael's jaw tightens, emotion flickering behind his eyes. I remember your crying, he admits. Hagar smiles faintly. I thought it was the end, she says. But heaven was listening. She doesn't need to explain. They both know the story by heart. God heard the boy, Genesis 21:17 paraphrased. God opened her eyes, Genesis 21:19 paraphrased. God was with him as he grew, Genesis 21:20 paraphrased. Ishmael looks out at the tents, his people, his future. You carried us, he says quietly. Hagar shakes her head. No, she answers. God carried us. I just kept walking. Silence rests between them, warm and holy. Then Ishmael asks the question that has lived in him for years. Mother, what should I tell my children about you? Hagar's eyes lift to the stars beginning to appear. Tell them I was wronged? Tell them I was cast out? Tell them I survived? All true, but not the deepest truth. So Hagar speaks slowly, choosing words like stones for a foundation. Tell them, she says, that I was seen. Ishmael turns toward her. Tell them there is a God who sees the invisible, Hagar continues. Tell them he does not only speak to the powerful. He comes to the broken, to the tired, to the ones who think they have been forgotten. She pauses, then adds the second truth, the one written into Ishmael's name. And tell them, God hears. Ishmael nods. God hears, he repeats, like a vow. Hagar squeezes his hand. When pressure rises in your tents, she says, do not become like the fear that drove us out. When jealousy whispers, answer it with mercy. When someone is weak, do not make them smaller. Her voice is gentle but firm, like an inheritance passed down. Open your eyes, she tells him, before you open your mouth, because God's provision is often nearer than you think. Ishmael's eyes glisten, but he doesn't look away. I will, he promises. Later that night, Hagar lies down. The camp settles into sleep. The desert wind hums softly around the tents. And in the quiet, Hagar prays, not with desperation now, but with peace. God who sees me, she whispers, Genesis 16:13 paraphrased. Thank you. God who hears, she adds. Thank you. Her breathing slows. Her heart is steady. She is not returning to Sarah's tent. She is not reclaiming Abraham's camp. She is returning to the one who met her in the wilderness. And the final message of her story becomes clear. Simple enough for any voice to tell, any listener to understand. If you feel unseen, God sees you. If you feel unheard, God hears you. If you are in a wilderness, God can open your eyes to a well. The desert does not get the last word. Mercy does. And somewhere under the same wide sky, Ishmael's people continue, living proof that a servant woman's tears were not wasted, and that heaven's attention can turn exile into legacy. Because the God of Genesis is not only the God of altars and promises, he is also the God who finds one trembling woman by a spring and calls her by name.